listeners, it's Yenny. Just letting you know that today's episode will include topics of cannibalism, death, and suicide. Listener discretion is advised. No cats. No panther cats.
No panther cats.
No bobcat. Why isn't it called a mountain cat?
That's mountain lion.
This just makes me think you need to go do an episode on the were-jaguar.
There's a whole list of like fearsome lumberjack creatures that
Hello.
I want to do.
Hello.
No. It's literally called fearsome critters, and they're like mythological animals of like the early logging days, like around the time of Paul Bunyan and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, like all of these. I want to go into those because I'm like, this is cryptid adjacent. This is 19th century cryptids.
I thought when you said lumberjack, you meant like an actual lumberjack.
I know what you thought.
6 foot wide frame, you know.
Exactly. So, welcome to Story Sirens, the podcast where we deep dive into myths and legends from around the world. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Yenny, and we are so glad to have a special guest returning to the podcast. Welcome back, Colyn DeGraaff. Yay!
Yay!
For our new listeners who may have missed you on our Mothman episode,
an outstanding episode from season 1. If you haven't already, check it out.
Would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me again. Hello, listeners. I'm Colyn DeGraaff. I'm the creative director for Cold Open Stories. We're a publishing house. Thank you. We're a publishing house that offers imprints and audiobooks for original worlds and fandoms. I'm also a scholar on international and intercultural communication in Western Canada, a street photographer, and relevant for this week's story, Algonquin on my grandfather's side.
Oh, this is so cool. And as he mentioned, this is relevant because today we are doing a deep dive into some North American mythology, specifically mythology and folklore of the First Nations.
So let's travel to the Great Lakes and into Canada to meet our fate. Ooh. Today we are talking about the dreadful Wendigo.
Now, the Wendigo appears in the folklore of several tribes, known as the Wetiko in Algonquin, and Colyn will correct me if I butcher these, I'm sure. In Ojibwa, it's the Wintico it's the Wendigo in Ojibwa and the Wintico in Powhatan. The term usually is associated with a cannibalistic spirit that is driven by greed and consumption.
In the traditional Algonquian world, the Wendigo is the spirit of selfishness, which can transform a person into a murderous man-eater. The very name Wendigo roughly translates to the evil spirit that devours mankind, and at least one early explorer simply glossed it as meaning cannibal.
So when we engage with the Wendigo legend, we need to pay respect to its cultural roots, that this wasn't your Dracula or Frankenstein that popped out. And now, again, Frankenstein coming out of, what was a 17-year-old Mary Shelley? Incredible creation. The Wendigo has...
We'll be covering that soon, and there's a lot of layers there, but it's an entirely different cultural touchstone.
Came from its own cultural storytelling roots. The Wendigo is part of a larger societal framework and structure for storytelling, for morality tales that goes back hundreds of years. So it's not just a spooky story that you tell around a campfire. It is something that has been used to try to guide social structures, as well as protect people in communities. And like mentioned, the legend originates within the First Nations of North America. So you'll have the Algonquin, the Cree, the Chippewa, the Ojibwe, and the Innu, Saulteaux, and again, all the variations of that name that we'll be kind of, I would believe, sticking with just Wendigo as our typical pronunciation, just because it's a little bit more common for listeners to understand as well. But again, this has featured into all the traditions, was first encountered by French Jesuit missionaries when they began transcribing these stories into written word. They had been an oral history and tradition by then, but it's not a reductive cryptid lurking the woods in the way a non-native person might think of Bigfoot. It is something much larger than that. And so I believe,
and as you were saying, this is a creature or an entity that spans multiple tribes, a massive geographical area. This is not like, this is the one boogeyman of one specific tribe. This was something that was indicative and rooted in multiple different
Yeah,
peoples.
and it's actually very hard to nail down because when we think about a written oral or a written tradition, it gets written one way and then passed down. You might have a couple edits. There are some very
Mm-hmm.
divergent tales of the Wendigo that
Mm-hmm.
don't follow the similar structure at all. So you may have
Okay.
one was where a person was changed into a Wendigo because this cold wind blew through the community and changed a person. Another was a person went out into the woods and killed their trapping partner and consumed them and came back and tried to consume other people as well. So it what makes it really hard is that, and I think this is also where there's a great correlation to Mothman, is the idea of having one core story. It's something we really like. We liked having the authoritative documentation. We like having the
Yeah.
tale where everything stems from that. But because communities are so dispersed across North America, there isn't one, but there's a root. There's a core lesson or a
Mm-hmm.
core
Okay.
folklore reason why the Wendigo exists, and ideally, we'll be able to sort of break that down over the concept of today. One
Cool.
of those
Well,
is
let's
that
go in.
we have to survive the winter alone, or
Mm-hmm.
sorry, we have to survive the winter together.
It's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
else the fate of the Wendigo arrives. So if you're talking about the moral or spiritual threat that could arise, the Wendigo is the warning of we have to work together. It's also the rejection of cannibalism, which is just if you consume
Right.
human flesh, you're committing an evil act. Those are two
Right.
components that are standard across all tales, is that it usually comes in the shoulder season of winter and eating other people bad.
Well,
Yes. Which
mhm.
classically, that's, I mean, for the most part, that is kind of the classical utmost taboo for so many cultures.
Yes.
But the fact that, here in the First Nations, when, again, we are in these Rocky Mountain regions, we are in these Great Lake regions where winter can be horrible. I mean, we've heard the horror tales of certain parties that had to, go into that taboo of cannibalism in order to
Yes.
survive.
It was
But this
actually
is a cautionary tale in order to say, let us not get to this point.
Yeah. I mean, and I remember that there was a real telling, and they made it into a movie, of this plane that crashed during
Oh, yeah.
the winter time, and some of the people on the plane had passed, and they had no food, and so they would take turns, one of them going to like cut pieces off of
Yeah,
the person.
yeah.
They needed to survive, but it is, as Sarah says, taboo, because in a lot of cultures, specifically I could say for Hispanic, that's like you're taking a piece of someone else's soul and you're darkening your own soul because you're not supposed
Mhm.
to eat someone else.
The loss of the soul
It's
is one of
crazy.
the most, again, we protect it. I remember growing up and seeing that episode where Bart Simpson sells his soul, on a piece of
Uh-huh.
paper, and affected me deeply at a very ripe young age, because it's something we know that we shouldn't be doing, because there's no real
Right.
way to fix it, because it's so metaphysical. And so,
Yes.
whereas it's like, oh, you hurt your arm, you put a bandage on, but we are suspect of like, well, does prayer work? And I know, and the story you're talking about, we were live about the plane crash in the Andes, right? With the
Yes,
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
Argentina.
one.
It's
Yeah.
it's one of these things where you go, were those people changed? And the cultural stigma that existed to the survivors after they came back was very
Because it's
significant. Yeah.
so, they would have rather you
well, and also,
died
Mhm.
than
well, but I
to.
mean, also they had to survive that for what, 70 plus
Mhm.
days. So, and as you said, yeah, there was this whole cultural stigma around him where it was, you should have died and retained your
Yeah.
humanity rather than been reduced to this animalistic nature. So with that in mind, let's continue with this. Why is this exactly
Sarah's the referee
so
today.
Yeah.
If the listeners have not realized, Sarah is the referee today, because usually Yenny goes on tangents, but now Yenny has Colin to go on tangents, and then Sarah's like,
All three of
"No."
us will just go straight into
Yeah.
it.
So
I just want to.
if we think
No,
about the
we need her.
legend moralizing hunger, starvation might really
Okay.
suck, but
Yeah.
to eat another person means that you lose your humanity entirely, and that
Mhm.
transformation is central to what the Wendigo is. It is a story of transformation and metamorphosis, of turning into something different. And it also did function later with the European settlers into a way of explaining when people have changed because we've had a stressful winter, we ran out of food, we were malnourished. Well, when the Europeans started to analyze this out during the westward settlement, you had the idea of, well, the Wendigo, Western psychiatry must know more, right? And what happened was
Yeah.
it became a mental health concept. So Wendigo starvation or Wendigo sickness provided a framework to understand aberrant behavior. So if someone had cannibalistic impulses or split personality disorder, or it wasn't looked at with the cultural lens of what First Nations people would say that this person's suffering, Europeans would try to, psychoanalyze. But the word popped over into,
Yeah.
and so although the
Into more clinical
yeah,
terms.
and although the Jesuit missionaries were the first ones who recorded these stories, it very over time, and there's also other impacts of trying to take away First Nations language and trying to control
Yeah.
First Nation populations, where the Wendigo was like, oh wow, what a savage story! How could you say something so ignoble to European sensibilities? And so that
Mhm.
just becomes something else that we'll end up discussing.
Right. And so, just to sort of briefly touch on what the Wendigo means from a more First Nation centric point of view is, as Colin mentioned earlier, this is not a reductive, fantastical cryptid like Bigfoot or Mothman. The Wendigo was not something that you could go out on the hunt for or anything like that. This was something to be warded off. This was something that came from taboo, from wrong behavior. I'm not just talking about, oh, well, you told a fib and now you're going to turn into a monster. No, like this stems from wrong behavior, and it was also a warning to help keep the community safe and together. And so the Wendigo, as we've come to understand it, is this fearsome creature that is, as we've already hinted at, frequently associated with winter and starvation. Those are kind of the two consistent themes throughout all the variations of the Wendigo story.
I feel like that would make sense because during winter is when there is no food, starvation hits. You start switching into being a little bit more crazed, right? Because you're hungry,
Cabin
you're
fever.
cold. A lot of things go wrong during that time period. It's a beautiful time, but it's also a very bad time. So
It's beautiful if you are prepared.
Oh, yes.
My dad used to say
Or
that
live
he
in
loved-
Miami.
Well, my dad used to say he loved watching winter from the comfort of inside a house,
Amen, Papa.
next to a fireplace, with like a hot cup of coffee or tea in his hand.
Yes.
So he was like, I can watch this as an observer, and I don't have to be in it.
Yes.
So. But away from the coziness and back into the horror, the Wendigo, again, varies from story to story, but some of its descriptors include it being a man-hunting monster that stalks its prey, or it is a cursed human who is insatiable and now cannibalistic. Now, some stories claim the Wendigo is fully a malevolent spiritual entity that enters through its victims' dreams. Those who are suffering from starvation, or on the flip side, who are insatiably greedy and often succumb to gluttony, are the most susceptible to being possessed by the spirit of a Wendigo.
Yeah, and when we say the spirit, it's not just this, roaming ghost that's going to pop into you. It's something born within your own soul. And I think that's the hardest thing to correlate, is that a modern assumption is the Wendigo is something vampiric or like a werewolf. It's definitely something born of people. Like we are the darkest side of nature. We have both the capacity for great strength and great ill. But
it's like a spiritual devolution.
Yeah, but it comes from within us. There's not this Judeo-Christian idea that it's a demon talking to you. It's something that is born out of your own self.
So the light within you starts turning dark.
Yes.
In other words.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying it's like this spiritual devolution where, first there's greed, and then there's greed accompanied by gluttony, and then there's like this disregard for your fellow man and everything. So of course it's this continual devolution, corruption, until it sounds like it manifests into the Wendigo being. So,
and I know both of you.
Why...
Go ahead, Yanni.
Oh. No, I was gonna say something stupid.
Well, have at it.
And that's why we need the Huntrix to seal the honeymoon, so that Wendigos cannot take over.
They're actually the touring band from Canada. They'll come over to South Korea.
There we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
There we go.
In the idea of, I don't think that they would be wearing quite the same clothing, but
Costumes.
yeah, you both know
They could.
from pop culture what a Wendigo looks like, and maybe
Yeah.
you can tell me a little bit about the physical and spiritual descriptions of what you think it looks like.
But before you deep dive into that, like Yinny, off the top of your head, like if I say Wendigo, what pops in your mind?
Definitely not someone in stilettos. It would be someone that's because I always feel like they're tall and gangly. Like I just mentioned.
Oh, like on
it.
stilts.
Yeah.
On stilts.
No, but
Okay.
But like I also think of stilettos when I think of stilts. So
Good
the
point.
reason why maybe your listeners are like, what are you guys talking about? I was talking in the bonus content about a convention that I went to that I saw one of the guests. Not one of the guests. One of the people come in and they were dressed as a Wendigo and they were looking amazing, had on stilts because they were gangly and stuff. So that was kind of how I feel like they would look like. I feel like also they would wear maybe like a skull of an animal because they're gaunt and stuff. So they'll like hide themselves so you can't see their face. I'd also go with what Colin said in our bonus content that they're like, filled with rags or like maybe a little bloody. They smell bad. So that's what I think. What about you,
Cool.
Sarah?
I mean, if you say Wendigo, what pops into my head is tall, skinny, scary, antlered being.
Antler.
That
There you go.
Yeah, antlers. Always antlers, because that's Hollywood saw that one time and went, yes,
Yep.
this is what we're putting on all of them. Just like, Bela Lugosi had a fantastic widow's peak, and now all vampires have to have widow's peaks.
And Colin, even though in our bonus content you did mention that you believe that you encountered a Wendigo, we'll not talk about it because you must have the bonus content for it. But tell us, what do you think a Wendigo would look like?
Very elongated limbs, skeletally thin, completely nude, pale, no lips, yellow teeth. That would be the equivalent for myself. And the nudity comes from the idea of that it is never satiated. And the clothes, I think, is when we think about like fur trappers that have been out in the wild too long and then they succumb. But the Wendigo, for me, my first pop culture memory in story that wasn't a story from our family unit was actually in the comics from Dark Horse, BPRD. There's a character called Daryl who is a man who turns into a Wendigo, and it's a tragic story. And what I find very interesting about that is the closest to the folklore. It is something that we try to ward off against, and it's sad when it happens. But that sadness very quickly turns to fear and panic, because you can feel sad for the person because they changed, but now you are also threatened by it. And there's this sort of thing that is very hard to communicate when you are both sad and scared at the same time. We like to treat those as two very different things. This, again, Guillermo del Toro, I think, does it very, very well with that sympathy for the monster. But that would be what I think of when I picture a Wendigo.
Well, we're not exactly wrong in the way that we're thinking or believing that it could look like, because from the facts that we have, or the tales that we have from First People and other stories, its physical form is often described as having gray or ashen skin. Sometimes it's described as being over 15 feet tall, which, imagine running into something. I would just run the other way. I wouldn't even be there in the first place. But if I was, because Sarah got me into camping, I would run the other way. So
the other component for the traditions is that because it is towering and gaunt, when it eats, and that it is its compulsion, it must continue to feed. But the fact that they go out there and they must hunt and they must kill and they must eat, but no matter how much they eat, they will never be full and they will never retain any of that body fat. And so it's the sort of curse of the Wendigo, is to say, even if it comes into a community after this person has been changed, or a person in the community changes and starts to feed on others, it will never be sated. And I think that greed is another component of you consume, but physically you will never be full. which is another,
Yeah.
spinning off of into different ways that the folklore has been adapted as a symbol for other things.
Some other physical characteristics include the fact that some traditions say the Wendigo grows in size after each meal. So that helps with the either distension or the elongation. Again, just those elements of when you look at something, you're like, oh, this is not right.
Right.
But other characteristics include glowing eyes, exposed sharp teeth as the lips have been chewed off. And some accounts say that it is completely naked and nude because it was once human. Some say it has become furred as it's becoming more animalistic. Some stories say the Wendigo has pointed ears, claws, or as we have mentioned, antlers. But what is consistent across many of these myths is that the Wendigo is accompanied by the smell of rotting flesh, which, if you've ever been downwind of a dead animal or anything like that, that is nature's best turn back signal.
It is, and for indigenous peoples or early European settlers, that smell is don't go near. There may be something trying to feed on it, or don't consume it yourself. That bad, you will get sick. It's self-preservation, right?
Yeah.
But the thing, one of the things that I obviously have as a craw, and we've talked about outside, is I have a major problem with the antlers or the stag's head. Because
let's address that.
It's not historically accurate. This is a modern invention. When it appears,
like I said, Hollywood saw that and they were like, let's do it for all of them.
When it started to get mainstream attention in pop culture in the last 50 years, what happened was there was this idea of like, well, we got to make it more animalistic because we were looking at with a traditional American lens of transformation. So if the werewolf goes from person into wolf, it takes on the animal characteristics. If it's the Yeti, well, it's a big furry beast. Things that are in the wilds must have fur and must be derived from some sort of animal archetype. And that's where the early antler depictions came from, was within the last 50 years of people saying, well, it has to have that corpse-like body, but give it a deer skull or give it antlers.
Got it.
That's where I got, like, when I thought about it, I'm like, maybe it ate like an animal and then it puts it on because it doesn't want to see itself. Because with the Wendigo, if it is a human that has gone through and become, like darkened, I would still feel, oh my God, the sympathy that you're talking about, Colin. I would still feel like they had something left of their humanity, whatever small, and perhaps they look at themselves and they, like in the water or something, they're like, oh my God, I'm disgusting. And so they'd hide themselves.
I wish that was the historical context, but stories change. Like we always try to pigeonhole and say, this is the one authoritative text. This is what it must be.
Yeah.
And that's not how oral storytelling or even our monsters exist. Like we retell, Dracula every decade to fulfill a different sort of, fear within community.
We retell Cinderella, like between Dracula
a different
and Cinderella,
kind of fear.
Those are the two.
Yes.
Those are the two most literally the two most adapted film series.
Oh,
and I mean, if you think about it, the newest Cinderella movie that just came out this year is a horror movie from the perspective of Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister or something like that. But I mean, it is not only is there a root to these fears and to these stories, it's the fact that they're not done with that generation. They continue to evolve and metamorph and all this sort of stuff. So, sorry, that was a little rambly.
No, it's not rambly. And just in case anybody wants to fight me, Hilary Duff's Cinderella story was the best one, okay? I'm just saying.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good.
Because whatever the other ones have been, I don't know. But Cinderella story.
It is interesting to note, though, how any story changes to reflect the culture that's a part of it. I mean, the last 50 years of Wendigo for the United States and pop culture versus a 100-year lens with the RCMP and with Canadian residential schools and the issues that we maintain for the savagery of Native peoples.
Yeah.
But then you look at the last 400, 500, 600 years of the Wendigo, the earliest written documentation in the 1600s. But it would have existed far beyond that. It changes after European contact.
Yeah, because we have ages of oral tradition, and then we try to write it down when they meet a new people group, and then we try to say, as you said, this is the authoritative, definitive explanation.
Right.
So Wendigos were often believed to have great strength, a keen sense of smell, hearing, and sight to better allow them to hunt their prey, and could easily run through snowy territories where they were most likely to be
No.
found.
And Wendigo's not just incredibly strong, but intelligent. I mean, that's the scariest monster there is,
Yeah.
right? It's not just an animal out there. It can mimic human speech, and that was either the
Oof.
idea of a person who had turned into one and was out in the woods and trying to lure you out to join it, or a person who looks like your neighbor, but
Yeah.
it lives in your community, but something's off about them, something is wrong. And so again, it's
Yeah.
that the idea of the fear within. In other stories, sometimes based on the retelling, whether it was Cree or Ojibwe, like they can have like straight up magical powers to control the weather. um
Oh,
like winter storms will come in because it will harbor
Hmm.
their arrival. um
right.
Possession is always a component of whether it gets inside your mind, so you will have nightmares and dreams and that spiritual intrusion.
Ooh.
But
Oh,
it's
no.
again very conflicting whether what community is telling it. Is it a spirit that has been carried by the northern lights and the winds, and now it's trying to change you, or is it your own internal
Is it
darkness?
from within you
Exactly.
already?
So when we think about like
Oh.
the idea of belief, or dreaming, that even dreaming of a Wendigo could invite its influence, telling the story of the Wendigo is cautionary. You don't say this of like, hey, let me tell you around the campfire about a Wendigo and be careful out there. Just talking about it is giving it power. So you would want to
Mm.
treat this with a degree of reverence and respect, of saying, listen closely. I'm only going to say this once. And when we talk about elders and spiritual storytelling as well within our cultural history, for First Nations, it's um, and I say we inclusive of across the United States, across North America, of
Right.
what we have documented. It's listen to your elders, and
Yeah.
I think that's just consistent across the board as well.
And may I ask, am I correct in assuming that should the need to discuss the Wendigo arrive within a tribe, within a community, would that be because the elders are seeing we are already there's a threat, it is kind of on the periphery,
Yes.
and we need our community to come together to help sort of expel the
Right.
potential likelihood of it infiltrating the
Yes.
community. Am I correct in
Yes,
assuming
your
that?
elders,
Okay.
or more traditionally a shaman, would
Okay.
recognize that there was a low harvest this year, or that it looks like the winter season is going to be quite long or quite strong, and so that's when the story would be told as a preventative measure. The idea that if someone turns into a monster and you must do something to change them back doesn't really exist in the documented widespread record. If someone changes into a Wendigo,
Okay.
there is no coming back.
That's not there's not a
Yeah,
cure.
and
Okay.
I think that that's something that is very interesting. The idea that a person is irredeemable versus you can still be sad that it happened, but if
Mhm.
you're looking to a shaman for guidance, they're going to take care of business and deal with this in,
Yeah.
in a way
Yeah.
that is defensive, because you can't let the risk of that spread, and it needs to be eliminated with extreme prejudice, because it cannot be
Yeah.
negotiated with and it cannot be allowed to exist. And that just says, you eat a person, you're not coming back from that.
Exactly. And I do think that's very interesting considering the fact that here in the last 100 years or so within the realm of Western storytelling, and Western media, and to an extent, in some, Asian stories, Asian culture stories, but like there is this trend here coming up. There's this trend here where people love to redeem a villain. People love to give a redemption arc at the last minute. Uh and instead there has to be sort of this acceptance that at some point you have to cut off the
Mhm.
corruption. You have
Yeah.
to separate yourself from what is going to try to destroy the entire community. Which I do think that's one of the reasons that there's still such a staying power behind like zombie stories because,
Yes.
for the most
I see
part,
that.
most zombie stories do not have a cure in them unless it's like a really fun rom-com like Warm Bodies or something.
Yeah.
Most zombies, like you turn zombie, that's no longer your
Yeah.
brother, your sister, your mother, your father,
It's
and you
time
have
to
to
go.
either escape or destroy it. So
Yeah.
that was just I wanted to bring that up recently or here real quick just because like I said, like here in the last 100 years and especially like in the last 50 years or so, stories are loving to redeem an irredeemable villain and going, oh well,
Right.
he's gonna die throwing himself in
It's
front
that
of the bigger bad and all this sort of
romanticizing,
stuff. Yeah.
right? It's the romanticizing of it. And Colin, you were talking about how the peoples were not allowed to speak about the Wendigo because it could bring them back, or it can, lure them in, right? Because
Yeah.
they're speaking about them. The same thing goes in Chinese culture, which now I have become very used to with going ahead and about to get married. Um, what we talk about is whenever there's any type of paranormal activity happening with or around us, I have been taught we do not talk about it in the presence. You must leave, go far away enough so that whatever entity was there cannot hear you, and then you speak about it. Because if you speak about it, they will like latch onto you.
Yeah,
And the
speaking
moment
power.
that they latch onto you, sometimes even through exorcism or whatever it is, it will not go away and it will forever taint the person.
Mhm.
And we see that a lot also in Hispanic culture. If you're going to talk about something, whether it be a saint, a spirit, you better be careful if they're in the presence, if you're in the presence of them, because it can go very wrong. So, speaking about spirits, not talking about them when they're near, I feel like that has come through a lot of different cultures, especially Chinese culture. I feel like in China, there's a lot of superstitions that I'm learning about, and it's crazy. But I mean, long civilizations, they've been here for a while, so they know what they're doing.
Their
So
stories are sticking around.
yeah, exactly. But I know that we have some famous
We
Wendigos.
do.
So Colin, please tell us about
Yes.
this.
So, like you mentioned, the earliest record for written European, documentation would have been in the 1630s from Cree storytellers, and a lot of that came from, like I mentioned, the Jesuit missionaries that had come across. What's interesting about these early accounts is that the Wendigo is predominantly portrayed as male. There, Morton Teicher also, when he was doing recorded storytelling and looking at the historical record, there were 70 Wendigo cases, and there was a 4-to-3 ratio of male to female. And then
Huh.
another author had said that there were 15 female to 21 male. And so there's, when we think about the Wendigo, it is something that tends to afflict men more frequently. It's almost a gender parody, let's be fair, but when you hear about female Wendigo stories, there is a bit of a gendered lens that we can also notice in the historical record. Many of them are daughters rather than
Uh,
wives, whereas the Wendigo men are usually fathers. We see those sort of
Oh.
tropes appear. Um,
Honestly, I'm just glad that men are getting something because for a long time, every time we do monster stuff, Sarah and I, every listener knows somehow it's always the women. It's never the men. So maybe now I'm
Well,
happy.
does the affliction, and of course this is just me approaching it from my 21st century lens, but like the correlation between it's usually husbands and fathers and daughters,
Yeah.
is that a correlation between like the feeling of like responsibility and the need to provide and that sort of stuff? Is there a correlation to that, or is that
No,
just me
an argument
applying
could be
something
made
that's
for
not
that,
there?
because we know that the Wendigo spirit, and I don't say again as a ghost, but as like the spirit growing within, will
No, the
typically prey on people who are savaged by circumstance of feeling these feelings of
okay.
inadequacy or being able to survive through the winter. But
Ah.
what's interesting is that you have both the patriarchal idea of the strong man is as equally afflicted as the daughter.
Yeah, who's supposed to be
Who's
sort of protected on the
Yeah, and you would
inside.
think, oh,
Yeah.
the daughter is this cute, adorable, frail thing, like capital T, right? Both of them can be affected. So it actually creates more of a
That's very
lateral,
interesting.
fairness, that whether you are this strong, hearty man who is withering away in isolation, or you are a daughter who is, full of life and zest, both of you can be victimized by this. And so I personally think that that equality of risk is very smart from elders, and shaman, because what it does is it means no one is safe. If you were to say, oh, it will only
Right. It levels the playing
yeah,
field.
when you think about who the victim of a vampire has traditionally been, it's usually young women
Yes.
in a recent context. So the idea of saying
Yeah.
no, anyone is fair game, and we would see this in the fur trade accounts of Goodsell, Kane, Nelson. This is just consistent that
Right.
anyone can be afflicted. The story of famous Wendigos that I'm most familiar with is the one that takes place in my where I live. I'm in Alberta, and it's the individual Swift Runner. Are either of
Okay.
you familiar with Swift Runner? It's probably one of the more um, common stories that people will hear.
I think I've
I
heard
have heard it.
this. Yeah.
I've heard it in passing just because my family's had a long fascination with the trapping era and, the mountain men and all that sort of stuff, but I do not have a firm
Okay.
understanding.
So the shortened version was that Swift Runner was a indigenous trapper and guide in the 1800s, and what happened was European settlers arrived and they killed off all the buffalo in the area in order to effectively force native peoples off their land.
Mm.
And it without any food, he took his mother, brother, and wife and children into the wilderness to look for food, but it was already so close to the winter season that they weren't going to find anything. And so when he returned to communities, because again, you get snowed in, you're not traveling long distances, when he
Right.
came back in the spring, it was just him. And
Oh.
what happened was the wife's family, who lived amongst the community, they were very suspicious the fact that he came back and he did not look ill or unwell. And so when they
Oh.
went to the campsite to figure out where the loved ones had passed, Swift Runner broke down and confessed that he had cooked and eaten the rest of his family, and his claim was that a Wendigo spirit had turned him into a Wendigo, and he was arrested and tried and hung at Fort Saskatchewan. So that's kind of
Holy
one of the
smokes. Yeah.
most famous Wendigo stories from the historical record. Another was Jack Fiddler, who was a shaman, and so when we talk about like what has the power to fight a Wendigo, it's always a shaman. Um,
Yeah.
Right.
he actually said he had the powers to fight Wendigos, and he claimed that he had killed 14 over his lifetime.
Holy
And what
smokes.
happened was with the Hudson Bay Company and missionaries entering into the area, um, there was always this like, okay, we know what the shamans do. They have this a story, but it did color a lot of the European view to look at the Wendigo story as well. These indigenous people are savages, right? Like what a
Hmm.
ookie kooky story. Whereas you then think of ghosts and goblins in the European record, and you go
Yeah.
what? But
We are so much
so
more
much more.
enlightened. Yeah.
But it was
Yeah.
in the more recently, it was in the early 1900s that they heard about Fiddler's Wendigo killings, and the Northwest Mounted Police went out and they arrested him and his brother because they thought, oh, you're out there murdering people. Those 14 people were human beings, and his argument was no, they were Wendigo, and inexplicably he was able to escape custody. He broke out,
Oh.
and he ended up going on the run a little bit, but after his detention and escape, he ended up hanging himself. Um and
Any idea why?
there are different reasons, but if we were to look from
Okay.
the two you would obviously think is a Eurocentric view of, well, he then was living with the guilt and the blame because the newspapers at the time were sensationalized that he was a murderer, he was not a shaman, he was a witch of some kind.
Yeah. Yeah. There it is.
There
There's
it
the
Yeah.
word.
is.
The other is that some people would say, oh, was he must have been affected by the things that he hunted. That's more of a modern retelling. It is more than likely that the suffering that he had incurred, any torturings or beatings by the Northwest Mounted Police would have been too traumatic, and he wouldn't have been able to go anywhere. His brother
Okay.
also, who had been charged and been arrested, he actually passed 3 days in custody before he was to be pardoned because they were putting all the blame on
Oh.
Jack Fiddler.
Okay. Oh, that's so sad. That is so
Yeah.
sad.
There's a lot. I mean, you've got stories of a Wendigo in Fort Vermilion, Alberta, that was like helped by nuns, and you've got, oh, what was there? There was the other one about the story where it came to a community, and it during a harsh season, and it brought food for the people there, and inadvertently it was actually more of a trickster spirit, and it was trying to get them to
Really?
consume other people as well. And because they didn't determine its origin, it ended up feeding them people. And so this community was just fractured and broken by that. You also had
Holy smokes.
Sandy Lake, the story of Sandy in Sandy Lake Cree, where a shaman dark sky asked an old man to marry his young daughter, and the guy was like, no. And so he summoned a Wendigo into the man's daughter. And so when you think of the shaman being a something that can combat the Wendigo, it's also something that shamans could control them. So if we're thinking about elemental forces, it's something where it's I again, different traditions, different storytelling between, Algonquin and Cree and Ojibwe. There's no one story. There's no, one telling of it.
Okay. Now, can you go back to the story of the Wendigo helped, quote unquote, by nuns?
Yeah. So
Yeah, I
What
heard
what
that.
exactly happened there?
so
The nuns made it out alive
yeah,
because
so
of the
this was one of the
Wendigo.
first cases of Wendigo sickness. The idea that someone came to nuns and said, "Hey, look, I ate my neighbor, and I'm very
That's a
troubled."
strong
Yep.
start.
Oh, but lead with truth. Um,
Yes, yes. I just yeah, the fact that they just went ahead and they did admit to it. Good
yeah.
for them. Just
Yeah.
oh yeah.
But
Okay,
the idea
continue.
now, if you are a religion that is focused on teaching the sacrament or teaching
Hmm.
redemption, you had this person who arrives saying, "I've done something terrible," and they want to help them redeem themselves. And so then you enter into the
Right.
Yeah.
conversion, storytelling of, well, this person was afflicted, and we just needed good old Christianity to solve their woes. That sort of helped, ends up being part of a very long standing problem within the 18th century of the idea of indigenous people cannot control their own communities. It is savage, and so we, the Europeans, need to fix them. And so one of the things that we've
Mm.
reconciled in Canada with our Truth and Reconciliation Committee is to say we really screwed it up, and we were tearing indigenous kids away from their parents. And we were trying to re-educate, and that re-education comes from this idea that your culture is not good enough, and we need
Yeah.
to train you differently. But when we look at that intersection of indigenous suffering at the hands of colonialism, you can see the Wendigo even intersects with that, with
Yeah.
early missionaries and being quote unquote helped. The Wendigo then after that kind of becomes something a little bit different. You don't hear about it appearing and creating these sort of transformative experiences, except there was one that I vividly remember was in 2008. And listeners may be familiar with
Oh
this
great,
one.
the Wendigos in the 21st
Went
century. Yeah.
modern, right? Was not to downplay the idea of the Wendigo falling out of public favor or any sort of storytelling. It's just a lot of those stories went underground because of how Europeans were treating indigenous communities, right? Like it became
Oh my
uncouth to tell
gosh.
these
Oh.
stories and being told your stories are not good. So if we say
Right.
that those then
Mm-hmm.
kind of disappear or being ripped out by the root in a traumatizing way, and we have to reconcile, the way that First Nations were treated, those
Yes.
stories kind of fade into some degree of obscurity because you wouldn't want to share those stories. But something that existed was, it wasn't just,
It's drawing the attention of a different
it
sort of
was.
powerful
And
figure.
also, if you're
Yeah.
being, tortured or treated ill, you're not going to tell Europeans your stories either
Right.
for risk. But that's the thing, is that there's also the warning of, hey, Europeans, you could also turn into a Wendigo. This isn't something that we own. This is something that can affect you. Bless you. Uh,
Thank you.
the idea of saying, we want to warn you, settlers, about this. The idea of saying, well, you could turn into this creature or monster, and you go, oh, demonic possession, because that's the closest
Mm-hmm.
cultural analogy for possession that exists. That's
This kind of touches on some cultures are just not compatible.
well, yes,
Where
it's not a one-to-one transcription.
No, it isn't. But like when one culture is trying to understand from the highest possible light, if one culture is trying to understand another culture's warning and the closest that they can equate it to is not even hitting the mark, that is going to lead to absolute
Mhm.
disaster, I would
Mhm.
assume.
Well, it's the idea of, oh, these people know the devil, and it's like, no, 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 no. Like you're oversimplifying it.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
idea of possession remains intact, and like I had alluded to with 2008, the idea that you don't have to be First Nation for the Wendigo to grow within your ice cold heart. There was the killing of Tim McLean on a Greyhound bus in 2008, where Vince Lee, the killer, had grabbed him on the bus and decapitated this poor man without any sort of warning. And a lot of people, said it was a psychotic break, and he went to trial. And a lot of people have issues
Oh
with
my
how quickly
gosh.
he was discharged with the pretense of psychology. But that was
Right?
something that a lot of communities said, well, that's the idea of a Wendigo affecting you. So again, that Wendigo psychosis
Really?
and the dark of the winter and affecting people, manifesting in very strange ways. Those are again a couple of the famous Wendigos. But I would encourage anyone who wants to read more of like significant texts to look up Swift Runner or Jack Fiddler.
Okay. Okay. So now with those real life stories in mind, let's talk about the roles of a shaman defeating a Wendigo and preventative measures to take against the Wendigo. It was believed that a shaman must be the one to assist in banishing the Wendigo's evil spirit. And there were some reports saying that they would use tools made of silver, steel, and iron to deter the Wendigo, but that sounds like a lot of European
Mhm.
influence, just with the whole use of, silver deters vampires and werewolves, iron deters the Fae. Not entirely sure. Uh, and as with many supernatural monsters, destroying the Wendigo's heart was one of the surest ways to banish the evil, according to some
Yes, the
myths.
the the heart was thought of to be encapsulated in ice, so it wasn't just something that you stabbed through the chest like a stake or something like that, and you hit it.
Uh huh.
It's the idea that you needed something powerful to break it, or you needed even powerful words to crack it. One of the stories was that by telling the Wendigo what it did wrong, you actually are able to crack pieces of its heart and induce
Oh.
shame, which makes it more susceptible to being banished or
Oh.
assaulted or destroyed. So it's that idea of speaking truth to what you've done, or a community
Mm-hmm.
giving a shaman the courage and the power to say, you go tell them what they did was wrong. And I think that morality wise is a very strong and powerful motive of social control, to say, no, you were bad. You go, oh, my heart, you're wounding me. But that is a form of addressing. And so these shamans,
Well, it's a whole a community holding each other
accountable. Yes.
accountable.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is something that people
Yeah.
need.
But it would still be the role of the shaman to euthanize someone who had become a Wendigo. This is not something where
Ooh,
you're just
okay.
expected to go out and, oh, my neighbor's a Wendigo, and I just shoot them, and it's all solved, right? Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
you need expert support, and part of the reason for that is to make sure that it's not being done incorrectly, and also that it's not just born out of people taking vigilante control of the community into their own hands. It is not individualistic. You
Okay.
have to, because the shaman is still a representative of the entire tribe, right? Like you
You're
are your
moving as a
community. They are
community.
a head of the tribe, but they don't stand outside. They are within the circle. So the idea of, we will do this together.
Okay.
It's not superhero comes in and the shaman has magic powers. It's, we are uplifting the shaman to help lead us through this terrible time. Um,
Wow.
the
Okay.
if you take a different approach, and the idea of Wendigo psychosis that many 20th century Canadian doctors had, we're talking like shock therapy. We're talking about beating people until morale improves. We're talking about
Oh.
like, oh, we're gonna bash the monster out of you. Yeah, it's a different problem. But if we
Uh,
talk about the moral lesson, and I think that this will carry us into like the symbolism of what the Wendigo is,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the Canadian and First Nations telling of the Wendigo is more of that moral and spiritual. You do battle with it with the support of an elder shaman, and it's about the community standing up against this thing that could corrupt or consume everyone else, but it was born within the community, versus something that you have within pop culture, which is more of a person is possessed and you must need someone to rise up and slay it. I do hope listeners can
Oh, okay.
understand how similar but different those are.
So, with that in mind, let's head into the symbolism of the Wendigo, especially since, as Colin's been trying to help us understand, the Wendigo is not something that just pops up out of nowhere. It's not a monster that comes to affect a person. Most frequently, this is born from within a person, within a community, and anyone is a target. So, this creature is evil. This is not a simple misunderstanding of nature. This is a perversion of nature. The Wendigo believes that the way it can best survive is to consume everything: plant, animal, person. It views itself as a maybe not a superior being, but definitely the top. It is the only
Mhm.
priority. It is self serving, and everything around it is lesser and only fit for
It's
consumption.
selfish. That is
Yeah.
by eating and consuming without any restraint, you're being selfish. And if you are going to be doing
Hmm.
that in a community and you're eating everyone's food, that's you're harming the community. We ostracize
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
behavior. And so there, Basil Johnson, who's an Ojibwe scholar, described it as like the craving for human flesh is just such a strong metaphor for just consumption. And if we think about the idea of greed and gluttony in a modern context, it does not surprise me that this all-consuming thing that can never be fed has become a metaphor for greed, for power and
Yeah.
consumption, for
Yeah.
for the unchecked limitations of capitalism, right? Like it is
Yes. Yes.
definitely a close parallel. And then you go, oh well, it's just another way of talking about something that would have affected a tribe or a settlement in 1700s. We're not so different in the modern day. This is still a lesson that
No,
needs to
no,
be
no.
told.
Yeah. Symbolically, the Wendigo is believed to be a warning against hyperindividualism and isolationism, as well as a cautionary tale for the benefits of community. This need for community and sharing is evident in the creature's association with winter, when survival is toughest and resources are few and far between, like we've spoken about. And talking about the Wendigo, it gives a lot of like Seven Deadly Sins vibes. You know what I mean? Like everything is in there.
Well, it's
Greed.
the vices of
Yeah,
humanity,
yeah.
absolutely. Like Colin was mentioning earlier, these are stories that we saw written down in the 1600s. There was an oral tradition that predated it significantly, but this is not just a story that affects a singular generation. It continues to move throughout the world because this is still a very human centric creature, curse, problem, whatever you want to call it at this point. Because if the Wendigo was a warning against greed and gluttony in the First Nations, way before our modern technologies, way before the establishment of the United States of America, what does the warning of the Wendigo mean for us here in the 21st century? Here on Story Sirens, we frequently discuss the correlation between folklore, history, and humanity. And the Wendigo, terrifyingly enough, may be more relevant today than it has been in a long time,
Mm-hmm.
because we are in an age of overconsumption where the idea of keeping up with the Joneses is taken to the extreme and often to the harm of the self. There are people who are going into massive amounts of debt just so they can look like they have a certain lifestyle, so they can keep consuming. And the spirit of the Wendigo seems to be plaguing the 21st century insatiably. I mean, we can talk about the wealth gap, the disparity between the top 1% and the 99%. We can talk about the distribution of resources and how governments around the world are failing their people and therefore failing their communities. And so it really does seem like the Wendigo story is still relevant.
There's an additional nuance to that because I think that many of your listeners will understand the individualism and the dangers of just being me, greed,
Mm-hmm.
greed, greed. But it's also for the community as a whole. During the winter, you would become separated, you'd become snowed in, you wouldn't be able to interact with others. The danger of isolation, there is a metaphor to be had with our current social structures of how we don't know our neighbors as well as we used to.
Yeah.
We don't communicate in a civic plaza. It's all done online, so we don't get that face to face. And so if just as much if the Wendigo is about greed and self preservation at the expense of others, it is also a story for isolation and how that leads to desperation and madness and moral collapse. Because without
Which does make
Mhm.
sense. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but that does make sense, especially if you think back to 2020 during the lockdowns and people felt as if they were going out of their
Mhm.
minds. I mean, that was a horrible time for morale across the globe, and that it just you talking about the isolationism really did remind me of that. So I just wanted to say that real
Yeah,
quick. Sorry.
no,
Go
it's
ahead.
it's it's good because it's the idea of like when you're isolated and you're separated from your community. Humanity was not. We are the storytelling apes. We are the social creatures on this planet that we need community. We need to interact, but it's also really hard to do. Because we we
Mm-hmm.
we all have these individualistic impulses, and so the folklore relating to the idea of we need to work together becomes so much more prominent in the cold and in the winter and when our environment threatens us. I mean, if resources become scarce, hint, hint, you get into these sort of situations where it's like, well, we just have to work together by force. Otherwise, we are all going to perish, and we
Mm-hmm.
need to uplift people who can help guide us. But no one stands alone. Everyone is accountable
Yeah.
to everyone else, and the Wendigo spiritual transformation. And again, we've talked a lot about it possessing you, being born of your own ice heart. It still haunts as a overarching sort of spiritual place of transformation in lonely places. When you are not connected to your peers or to your community, you are more susceptible. If you are lost or you are stranded or you are locked up alone, it is more likely that your heart will harden, and you will also develop these aberrant, dangerous behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
A lot of wisdom to be found in that for hundreds of years ago. And I'm glad the story has permeated and existed despite so many attempts to erase it.
Right.
And to sort of glamorize it some by Hollywood, but I mean this story has staying power. And now I'm absolutely going to undercut your fantastic point you just made by saying, wouldn't it have been so much more interesting if Elsa and Anna had actually both been at risk of the Wendigo spirit in Frozen? Because you're just talking about that ice heart and the isolationism, and both of them were at risk for it.
Elsa did let it go, though. So.
She did. I'm sorry. It was just we got a little heavy there, and I just couldn't help myself. So with that in mind,
Anna's just got Kristoff's head in a headlock, is just chowing down. Yeah, it's a different.
exactly,
It's a
exactly.
cautionary tale.
Uh,
Yeah.
a cautionary
Mhm.
tale. So, no man is an island, and we do owe each other. So anyway, back to modern media. So as we've already mentioned, Hollywood has glamorized the Wendigo. But where else can we find it in modern media? Well, if you go to season 1, episode 2
Way
of
back.
Supernatural, we are going way back. Sam and Dean enter dangerous woods in search of a person they believe has been abducted by a Wendigo. While not historically accurate, definitely entertaining. Check out the
Yep.
show. You'll be watching it for about 10
Yep.
years.
The modern retelling for Lone Ranger, Johnny Depp's character Tonto is a Wendigo hunter, but he's not Algonquin, and I don't remember actually if he was Cree. But regardless, a little nod there of what you're out there doing.
That.
The book Never Whistle at Night, an indigenous dark fiction anthology, features several Wendigo stories.
And in other books, you've also got the Wendigo from Marvel Comics, who battles the Hulk. I think joins Alpha Flight as well.
Huh.
Yeah.
Really?
So you've got Wolverine and you've got Wendigo and several other Canadian, characters.
That's a fun fight to watch.
Mhm.
I was going to say, that's a very interesting crossover. For our nonfiction fans out there, Columbus and Other Cannibals by Jack D. Forbes talks about the 20th century presence of the Wendigo spirit in Western cultures. We were just talking about that quite a bit.
You've also got one of the texts in written Algernon Blackwood's 1910 British story, The Wendigo, set in Canada, one of the earliest fictional tales to present the Wendigo to an Anglophone audience, and really is credited with that sort of lean into supernatural horror and the wilderness.
The Only Good Indians novel by Stephen Graham Jones, master of horror and multiple-time Stoker Award winner, also features a Wendigo monstrosity.
And Ravenous, 1999, cult horror film set in the 1840s, all about people who have to resort to cannibalism. Now that you have, dear listener, a stronger understanding of the idea of individualism and isolation and what that does to your heart, go rewatch that film. It's something else.
I'm a little terrified of that. Pet Sematary from 2019. We've already touched on Stephen King's use of the Wendigo in the novel, and the 2019 film adaptation makes that much more visible. In the movie, there's actually a moment where the main character glimpses the Wendigo in the woods, a towering skeletal silhouette with antlers.
And antlers come back into full force. So let's two other examples with antlers. There is the film by Scott Cooper, Antlers, and it adapts a short story called The Quiet Boy, but gives it more Wendigo lore, set in Oregon. I know I've been talking a lot about the Canadian perspective on this, but again, the First Nations people did live and thrive across North America. So there's your Oregon connection. But again, deer-like Wendigo preying on people. And then one that I think went out under a lot of people's radar when it came out, they just thought it was a weird visual trope, was Hannibal, the TV series.
I remember that. I completely forgot about the series because it hit a point where I was like, I'm too chicken for this. But I do remember that sort of visual cue.
Yeah, Will Graham would have visions of this black-skinned creature with antlers. And I think a lot of people were just like, well, that's spooky and weird. But it really was them trying to speak the idea of this predator in midst who has an ice cold heart, who is feeding on other people, which of course it found its way artistically into Hannibal. The antlers are again another artistic license, but a very, I think, appropriate connection between how the Wendigo is not just this thing that once transformed is reckless. It is incredibly intelligent. And I think when we consider Hannibal Lecter, that is a wonderful connection of folklore and storytelling. Agreed.
Until Dawn from 2015, this cinematic horror video game for PlayStation gained a lot of attention for featuring Wendigos as the primary threat. In Until Dawn, a group of teenagers are stranded on a Canadian mountain 1 year after a tragedy. So check it out.
A terrifying game. Again, I haven't played it, but I've watched a friend of mine play it, and I was just like, how do you do this?
There's a film as well.
How do you stay locked
Yeah,
in?
I haven't seen the film yet, but I remember seeing clips from the game. I'm like, oh, they did it right. There's no antlers. So
oh, good. Okay, that's
Finally.
exciting. That's exciting. So, all right, friends, for our siren call, we are deep into the heart of autumn, and winter is fast approaching.
It's coming.
Winter is coming. Now's the perfect time to dive into some terrifying legends and then go talk to your friends and loved ones about them. You know, after you've been frightened, go do something cozy and community building. Maybe even have a watch party. I don't know, a listen party. Binge your favorite story sirens or cold open stories episodes. For your watch party, maybe check out Scott Cooper's film Antlers, or take some time and play Until Dawn with friends and all scream together and throw the popcorn. If you really want to do a deep dive, check out the book Dangerous Spirits, The Wendigo in Myth and History by Sean Smallman. But most importantly, keep those community ties strong. The days are growing short, the nights are growing long, and there is comfort and connection around the fire.
Yes, there is. Colyn, thank you so much for joining us again on the podcast and teaching us all about this fearsome, fearsome creature who Yenny did not get to have any sympathy for after all. Is there anything you'd like to promote right now before we sign off?
Sure. So Cold Open Stories has a fan fiction writing contest and anthology for the fandom of Warhammer 40,000 open right now, as well as an open call for our original worlds stories. We just released 9 new short stories on coldopenstories.com just in time for spooky season. And we also have an open voice acting casting call, and it's all over at coldopenstories.com.
Nice.
Everyone, go check that out immediately and go through their entire back catalog. Cold Open Stories produces some really fantastic audio treasures. So, all right, friends, we are nearing the end of our spooky season, but we'd love to keep the conversation going with you, dear listener. If you have more insights into the Wendigo legend or want to share your own supernatural experiences, please come join our public Discord server. The link to join is in our show notes, as it always shall be.
Exactly. Thank you guys for being with us here today, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Story Sirens. You can follow us on Instagram at Story Sirens Podcast. Want to support us? Send us a cup of Ko-fi by searching ko-fi.com/storysirens. We've got lots of treats for those who become siren seekers. All research materials can be found in the episode summary. Music by Donald Guzzi and artwork by Alexis Torres. Story Sirens is a Feather and Fin production. See you soon.